WHO has confirmed a new Hantavirus case in a Hondius crew member, repatriated to the Netherlands, isolating at home, and now positive. And that landed in the same news cycle as WHO's own document calling this response a model of IHR coordination.
This is Hantavirus Watch. I'm Brian, Cassidy's here, and today we're checking whether the machine WHO just praised actually held together.
We've got the Dakar lab story that finally shows how Andy's strain ID happened in the field, a specific statutory crack in the CDC quarantine orders, and that IHR self-assessment now sitting right next to a very inconvenient case study.
And if CDC quarantine authority depends on a disease list that doesn't even include hantavirus, I want to know what happens to the people still in that 42-day window when a lawyer steps in.
AFP, with Andrew Zinnin.
Today, the Netherlands confirmed an additional case among a crew member who disembarked in Tenerife, was repatriated to the Netherlands, and has been isolating since then. World Health Organization Chief Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said Friday. He said this meant there were now 12 suspected and confirmed cases in total, including 3 deaths.
WHO Director General Tedros confirmed Friday. A crew member who disembarked in Tenerife was repatriated to the Netherlands and had been isolating at home just tested positive for Andy's virus, bringing the total to 12 suspected and confirmed cases, 3 deaths, all 3 deaths before May 2nd. That crew member is now hospitalized. And on the Hondius monitoring window, WHO says more than 600 contacts are still under follow-up across 30 countries, with a small number of high-risk contacts still not located.
So, WHO's own IHR retrospective drops this week, calling the multi-country coordination a model response. And in the same news cycle, a crew member isolating at home in the Netherlands converts positive. That's not some abstract home quarantine question. That's a confirmed one. I want to know whether the Netherlands is now reviewing who else got sent home under that same protocol.
To be precise about what WHO actually said versus what people are inferring, Tedros confirmed the case, but he did not say how the transmission happened in Friday's statement. We know this person was on the Hondius. We do not have WHO on record saying whether this was a new exposure event or a delayed presentation from the original Patagonia window.
Sure, but a small number of high-risk contacts are still being located is the line that should be on the banner. 30 countries, 600-plus contacts, and some of them still aren't found. At what point does being located turn into a liability question for the operators who scattered people across a dozen ports?
Here's World Health Organization.
When the United Kingdom notified WHO on 2nd May 2026 of a cluster of severe respiratory illness cases aboard a Netherlands-flagged cruise ship in the Atlantic, passengers from 23 countries were on board. Within days, cases of hantavirus, Andy's strain, had been confirmed in the Netherlands, South Africa, and Switzerland. The ship was still at sea.
WHO published this IHR retrospective on May 22nd, framing the Hondius response as a model of multi-country coordination, with the UK notifying WHO on May 2nd, and confirmed cases in the Netherlands, South Africa, and Switzerland while the ship was still at sea. That's the self-assessment. What also hit this news cycle is a new Dutch crew case, confirmed by WHO via AFP, that came after the document was out.
So WHO puts out the "Here's how we nailed it" case study on Thursday, and by the weekend there's a fresh, confirmed case. A crew member who disembarked in the Canary Islands was repatriated to the Netherlands under home quarantine and converted positive. That's not a footnote to the success story. That's the rebuttal.
To be precise, WHO's IHR document lays out the notification chain. The UK triggered the IHR mechanism, WHO coordinated across 23 passenger nationalities, and strain identification came through external lab infrastructure, including what Reuters is now reporting was a Dakar-based facility brought in while the ship was still stranded. That part of the architecture seems to have worked. The question is whether detection to response covered the repatriation protocols the same way it covered the shipboard phase.
And that's exactly the gap. The IHR framework gets credit for the ship. The Dutch crew member who went home to the Netherlands and then tested positive, who owned that leg? Because WHO's self-assessment published 2 days before that case was confirmed. And I want to know whether home isolation was in the IHR playbook or just a national call nobody pushed back up the chain.
Reuters, with Jessica Donati.
Within 24 hours, they had produced a partial genome showing the illness affecting the passengers, cases 5 and 6, was the Andes strain of Hantavirus, known to spread through close human contact. Laboratories in South Africa and Switzerland reached the same conclusion that day.
The Reuters piece out of Dakar gives us the first sourced, dated account of how Andes strain identification actually happened, and the date is May 5th. Institut Pasteur de Dakar had a partial genome within 24 hours of specimens landing, with South Africa and Switzerland confirming the same day. That's when the strain bracket closed, and it happened while the ship was still stranded.
May 5th confirmation. So what was happening on that ship in the days before May 5th? Sick passengers, multiple ports of call, and nobody with a confirmed strain ID yet. That's the diagnostic gap I want on the record. Decisions were being made about disembarkation and contact tracing before anyone knew this was Andes confirmed human-to-human territory.
To be precise, what the May 5th result told them was the strain identity, and that then shaped everything downstream: quarantine duration, contact definitions, the human-to-human risk framing. That's also why the call went to Dakar specifically, a biomedical center an hour's flight from Cape Verde, not the flag state lab infrastructure, is what made the turnaround possible.
And that's a real institutional story. WHO had to reach into West Africa to get an answer the ship's own flag state couldn't deliver in time. I want to know what U.S. labs were doing in that same window, because if clinicians stateside were seeing returning passengers before May 5th, they were working without the confirmed strain call. Okay, so when health officials say a new case on the Hondius is part of this outbreak, how do they actually know it came from another sick person on the ship instead of, say, a rat a passenger ran into at a port stop?
It comes down to lab work, plus old-fashioned shoe leather contact tracing, and those two have to line up. On the lab side, the strain identity is the first big clue. Every case in this cluster has been linked to the Andes strain, which, per the ECDC, is typically associated with South America, consistent with the ship having departed Argentina. That matters because Andes is, as NBC News notes, the only hantavirus strain known to spread person to person. So once you confirm Andes, human-to-human transmission moves onto the table as a serious hypothesis, not a theoretical one. But strain match alone is not enough. Investigators still have to build a transmission chain. Who was in close contact with whom, when symptoms appeared relative to each other, and whether that timing fits the known incubation window for Andes virus. The ECDC flagged this as a rapidly evolving incident and said confirming or ruling out person-to-person spread is exactly what's driving the international contact tracing effort right now. A separate rodent exposure explanation would mean showing a specific case had documented contact with rodents or rodent-contaminated environments, a port visit, a shoreside excursion, at the right time before symptoms started, with no plausible human source. If investigators cannot find that rodent link and the case fits the chain of contacts on board, the person-to-person hypothesis gets stronger.
So if a new case pops up weeks later in a passenger who's already home in, say, Germany or the Netherlands, does that actually raise the alarm level? Or does the incubation period make that hard to read?
That timing question is exactly what epidemiologists are watching. And it's why the contact tracing effort is crossing so many borders. The CBC notes more than 30 people disembarked at a South Atlantic island stop before the first case was even reported, which makes the exposure window genuinely hard to pin down. The ECDC is explicit that this remains a preliminary assessment and will update as the picture sharpens. For listeners, if you were on the Hondius or in close contact with someone who was, the guidance from health officials is to reach out to your local health department or a clinician rather than waiting to see whether symptoms show up on their own. From Allison Young at Healthbeat.
The deadly Hantavirus that has killed 3 passengers from a cruise ship does not appear on a key list that gives the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention its expansive detention powers, a public health law expert told Healthbeat. That means the federal quarantine orders the agency is using to detain 2 exposed passengers could face legal challenges.
Allison Young at Healthbeat has the specific statutory problem. Hantavirus is not on the presidential executive order list of quarantinable communicable diseases. That's the list that gives CDC its detention authority. And the 2 passengers currently held at the National Quarantine Unit in Nebraska may be held under orders that have no explicit legal basis.
So CDC reversed the quarantine midstream, then reimposed it, and now we find out the underlying authority may not even cover this disease. If a legal challenge succeeds and those orders get lifted, those 2 people walk out while they're still inside the 42-day exposure window.
To be precise about what's sourced, one public health law expert told Healthbeat the orders could face challenges. That's not a filed lawsuit. That's a legal vulnerability being named. The distinction matters. What's confirmed is the statutory gap. The disease list exists, and Andy's Hantavirus is not on it.
And this lands the same week WHO is publishing an IHR self-assessment calling the multi-country response a coordination model. The coordination model has a hole in it that a federal judge could drive a writ through.
Have a question, correction, or story lead for Hantavirus Watch? Send it our way at hantaviruswatch@lanternpodcasts.com. We read your notes, and they help us keep the briefing useful and accurate. You'll find links to every story we covered today in the show notes, so if something caught your ear, you can take a closer look there. That's Hantavirus Watch for today. This is a Lantern podcast.